Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The stars were a distant memory as the expedition ship cut through the inky blackness of space. Earth was far behind, a shell of what it once had been, consumed by its endless hunger for resources. But the future of humanity lay ahead, gleaming in the form of Pandora, a planet that pulsed with life untouched, beautiful, and abundant in the resources Earth so desperately needed. The fleet had been sent to take what was necessary. There was no room for compromise. For many, it was a second chance at survival. For others, it was conquest masked in necessity. But for Hema, the chosen experiment, the hybrid, the Avatar, it was something else entirely. James Hudson felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement as he looked out the ship's viewport, the vibrant planet growing larger in the distance. His human eyes, blue and sharp, blinked reflexively as he leaned forward. But beneath his skin, in his very blood, something far more complex stirred. He wasn't fully human anymore, not since they altered him. He was part Navi now, linked by DNA to the indigenous people of Pandora, meant to blend in with them, to gather information that would make the conquest easier. He turned from the viewport, his hand absently brushing the back of his neck where the neural port lay embedded, a reminder of his dual nature. It had been years since the first expedition to Pandora ended in disaster, with Earth forces retreating in disgrace. But this time, humanity was returning in force, stronger, smarter, and with something they hadn't had before, him. The ship's intercom buzzed, and a familiar, cold voice filled the cabin. Hudson, report to command. James swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. Colonel Trent, the man responsible for this expedition's success or failure, was a ruthless leader. Trent saw the Navy as little more than an obstacle to be cleared, a primitive race standing in the way of Earth's salvation. The colonel didn't understand the Navy. James wasn't sure he fully did either, but he had begun to feel something a pull toward them. As he entered the command center, the usual crowd of officers and scientists bustled around, preparing for landing. Screens flickered with information, charts of Pandora's landscape, and weather patterns. Colonel Trent stood in the center, his broad shoulders squared and his face set in its usual grim expression. His cold eyes found James the moment he entered. "You're ready, Hudson?" the colonel asked, though it sounded more like an order than a question. James nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Yes, sir." Trent stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Good, because when we land, there's no turning back. Your mission is critical. We need those Navi tribes neutralized or, at the very least, on our side. If you fail, it's not just you that'll pay the price. All of Earth is counting on you." James nodded again, feeling the weight of the mission press down on him like a physical force. He'd trained for this moment for years. They had prepared him for it, altered his body, and shaped his mind. But no amount of preparation could fully prepare him for what lay ahead. "Remember, Hudson," Trent continued, his voice low and dangerous, "you may look like them, but you're one of us. Never forget that." James felt his heart thud in his chest as Trent's words echoed in his mind. He was human. He was an experiment. But what was he, really? As the ship broke through Pandora's atmosphere, the vibrant world came into view, a kaleidoscope of lush forests, towering mountains, and swirling rivers. Everything about this planet was alive, pulsating with a life force that James could feel even from the confines of the ship. The landing was smooth, too smooth, James thought, considering what they were about to do. As soon as the ship touched down, the military forces began deploying, securing the area with their heavy artillery, their towering mechs, and their grim determination. James felt the first stirrings of doubt as he prepared for his mission. He was to infiltrate a Navy tribe, earn their trust, and relay critical information back to Trent. It seemed simple enough on paper, but standing on Pandora's soil, breathing in its air, feeling the ground pulse beneath him, he realized how naive that plan was. For the first time, He wondered if he was ready for this. The Na'vi had not forgotten the first human invasion. They would not welcome him easily. And yet, his mission required it. He was their bridge, the one who would make the impossible happen. But standing there, surrounded by human soldiers preparing for war, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than himself. It didn't take long for him to find the Na'vi, or rather, for them to find him. He had been walking for hours, deep into the forest, marveling at how Pandora seemed to hum with life. Trees towered above him, their bioluminescent leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. Strange creatures scuttled through the underbrush, while others soared through the air, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkening sky. Suddenly, he felt Ida's presence, silent but unmistakable. His heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had been trained for this moment. He knew the Na'vi would approach him when they were ready, and not a moment before. It was near dusk when they appeared, slipping out from the shadows like living phantoms. Tall, lean, and graceful, the Na'vi moved with a fluidity that made James feel awkward and slow in comparison. Their golden eyes glowed in the fading light as they circled him, their expressions cautious and curious. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward. She spoke in their language, her voice low and melodic, but James didn't need the translation implant to understand her meaning. "Who are you?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, his moment of truth. "I am one of you," he said in halting Na'vi, the language still strange on his tongue. "But also not." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she did not move. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over his hybrid form, taking in the strange combination of human and Na'vi features. James held her gaze, refusing to look away, though every instinct screamed at him to run. Finally, she spoke again, this time in a tone that sent a chill down his spine. "Then what are you?" James hesitated. He could feel the weight of her question pressing down on him, demanding an answer that he wasn't sure he had. Was he human? Was he Na'vi? Or was he something else entirely, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither? "I am here to learn," he said slowly. "To understand." The woman's eyes flickered with something James couldn't quite place. She studied him for another long moment before nodding slightly. "Then come. But know this, outsider, if you betray us, there will be no mercy." The Na'vi were not what James had expected. They were more than the fierce warriors the military had described. They were a people deeply connected to their world, to each other, and to the life force they called Iwa. Over the days that followed, James found himself drawn deeper into their way of life. He hunted with them, learned their songs, and sat with them in the evenings, listening to their stories of the past. At first, they kept their distance, watching him with weary eyes, but gradually, they began to accept him, or at least tolerate his presence. The woman who had first confronted him, whose name he learned was Nra, seemed particularly intrigued by him. She was a leader among her people, strong and fierce, but also wise in a way that James had never encountered before. As the days turned into weeks, James found himself questioning everything he had been told about Pandora and the Na'vi. They were not savages, as the military had claimed. They were a proud and noble people, deeply connected to the world around them. The more time he spent with them, the more he began to understand the depth of their connection to Pandora and to Iwa. But the military's presence loomed over him like a dark cloud. Trent's voice echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the mission he had been sent to accomplish. Each day, he sent back reports, careful not to reveal too much, but knowing that eventually, the time would come when he would have to choose between his orders and his growing loyalty to the Na'vi. The turning point came when Nra led him to the Tree of Souls, the sacred place where the Na'vi connected with Iwa. James had heard of it before, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The tree towered above them, its glowing tendrils swaying gently in the breeze, pulsing with a life force that James could feel deep in his bones. "This is our heart," Nra said softly as they stood beneath the tree. Through HFY, we were all connected. The past, the present, the future, it is all one. James reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched one of the glowing tendrils. Instantly, he felt a surge of energy rush through him, a connection that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. For a brief moment, he saw the world through the eyes of the Navia, felt their pain, their joy, their fear, and their love for this world that was so different from Earth. It was in that moment that James realized the truth. He couldn't go through with it. He couldn't betray these people. He couldn't betray Pandora. But what could he do? The military was preparing for an all-out assault, and they would stop at nothing to take what they wanted. James knew that if he didn't act, Pandora would be lost forever. James stood in silence beneath the towering tree of souls, his heart pounding in his chest as the connection to HFY faded. The lingering sense of unity, of belonging, left him with an ache he hadn't expected. This was beyond anything he could have anticipated. Pandora wasn't just a planet, a place to be mined for resources and left barren. It was Alivia, intensely, vibrantly alive in a way that Earth hadn't been in centuries. Nra's gaze stayed on him, her expression hard to read, but her eyes were filled with a quiet intensity. "Do you understand now?" she asked softly. He nodded, but his mind was racing. Understanding wasn't the problem, it was knowing what to do with that understanding. His orders from Colonel Trent were explicit: to gain the trust of the Navy, gather intelligence, and, when the time came, assist in dismantling their defenses. But standing here, feeling Pandora's pulse beneath his feet, he realized the cost of those orders. If he followed through, if he did as he was told, it wouldn't just be the Navy who suffered, the entire planet would be destroyed. But defying Trent meant certain death. The military didn't forgive traitors. He'd be hunted down, made an example of. Worse, they would still come for Pandora. They wouldn't stop just because one man chose to switch sides. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest, Nra turned and gestured for him to follow. They made their way back to the Navy settlement in silence, but the weight of James's decision pressed on him with every step. He couldn't betray these people, not after all he had seen, not after the connection he had felt with HFY. But what could one man do against an entire military force? The night was unusually quiet, the usual hum of Pandora's creatures replaced by an eerie stillness. James lay awake in his hammock, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to act, but he didn't know where to begin. His reports back to the military had been deliberately vague in recent days, but soon, Trent would want more. He'd demand results. And when those results didn't come, they would send someone else, someone less conflicted, someone who wouldn't hesitate to wipe out the Navy. In the dead of night, he made his decision. He would warn them. He would tell Nra and the others what was coming and help them prepare. He didn't know how they could fight against the advanced weaponry of the human military, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. They had their bond with Pandora, and James had to believe that would count for something. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the settlement, James found Nra standing at the edge of the village, her eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't turn when he approached, but he could tell she knew he was there. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, his voice tight with urgency. She finally looked at him, her expression calm but questioning. "The humans," he continued, "they're coming. They're preparing an assault, and it's going to be massive. They're not just after resources anymore. They're coming to take everything." Nra's eyes darkened, but she didn't seem surprised. "We knew this day would come." "There's more," James said, his throat tightening. They plan to destroy the Tree of Souls." That got her attention. Nra's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They would not dare." "They would," he replied grimly. "And they will, unless we stop them." Nra turned fully to face him now, her gaze piercing. "You're one of them." "Why should we trust you?" James had expected the question, but it still stung. He had spent weeks with these people, lived among them, and yet he was still an outsider. But he understood. He had lied to them from the beginning, played the role of the loyal human infiltrator. Now, when everything was on the line, trust was not something that could be easily earned. "I'm not one of them," he said, the words coming out firmer than he had expected. "Not anymore. I've seen what this place is, what HFY means to you, and I can't let them destroy it. I won't." Henry studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will prepare." In the hours that followed, the Navy mobilized. James worked alongside them, helping where he could, though he knew it would never be enough. The Navy fought with bows and spears, with the natural power of their world at their backs, but they were up against an army armed with gunships, artillery, and exosuits. He tried to teach them what he could about human tactics, about the weaknesses of the machines they would face. But it still felt hopeless. As night fell once again, the tension in the air was palpable. The Navy gathered around the Tree of Souls, offering prayers to HFY, asking for guidance and protection. James stood among them, feeling out of place and yet deeply connected to this moment. He wasn't Navy, but he wasn't human anymore either, not in the way that mattered. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The sky lit up with the glow of gunships and rockets, the roar of engines filling the air. The ground shook as the first wave of human forces descended upon the Navy settlement. The Navy fought back fiercely, using the terrain to their advantage, striking from the trees and blending into the shadows. But the human forces were relentless, their advanced weaponry cutting through the forest like a blade. James found himself in the thick of the battle, his avatar body moving with a speed and agility that felt foreign and yet instinctive. He fought alongside the Navy, his bow in hand, striking down soldiers with a precision that surprised even him. But the human forces kept coming, wave after wave, their gunships circling above, raining fire down on the Navy below. Through the chaos, James caught sight of Colonel Trent, standing at the edge of the battlefield, watching with cold, calculating eyes. He was directing the assault, his every movement precise, detached. James knew that Trent didn't care about the lives lost, not the human soldiers, and certainly not the Navy. To him, this was a means to an end. Rage boiled up inside James, a deep, primal anger that he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for Pandora, for everything this planet represented. And Trent, with his cold indifference, was the embodiment of everything James had come to despise. He didn't think, he just moved. James darted through the battlefield, dodging gunfire and explosions, his eyes locked on Trent. He didn't know what he would do when he reached him, but he knew he had to stop him, had to end this. As he closed the distance, Trent finally noticed him. A flicker of surprise crossed the colonel's face, quickly replaced by contempt. "Hudson," he spat. "I should have known you'd betray us." James didn't respond. He couldn't. The anger pulsing through him made words impossible. He lunged at Trent, his bow raised, but the colonel was faster than he looked. He sidestepped James's attack and pulled a gun from his holster, aiming it squarely at James's chest. "You're just like them," Trent snarled. "Weak." "Nah, a tilde macron v. You actually believe you can save this place?" James gritted his teeth, his body tense. "This place doesn't need saving. It needs to be left alone." Trent's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a sudden roar filled the air. The ground trembled, and James looked up just in time to see one of Pandora's massive beasts, Scileanopteryx, swooping down from the sky. Its enormous wings beat the air as it dove toward the battlefield, scattering the human forces in its path. Trent's eyes widened in shock, and in that moment of distraction, James moved. He knocked the gun from Trent's hand and drove him to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. For a moment, they struggled, but James had the advantage. He raised his fist, ready to strike, but then hesitated. Killing Trent wouldn't end this. Stopping one man wouldn't change the course of the battle. The humans would keep coming, no matter what. Instead, James stood, his chest heaving, and looked down at Trent, who lay in the dirt, breathing heavily, his face twisted in rage. "It's over," James said quietly. "You've lost," Trent sneered. "You think this is over? It's just the beginning." But James didn't listen. He turned and walked away, his mind already on what had to be done next. The battle raged on around him, but he knew that this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. He had made his choice. He had chosen Pandora. And now, he would live with the consequences.